Everyone wants change, but no one wants the uncomfortable moment right before change begins. Inner resistance often feels like a vague cloud of hesitation, but at its core, it has a very specific origin. The first step to overcoming it is identifying exactly what is causing that internal friction. Most people assume resistance is simply procrastination, laziness, or lack of discipline, but those are surface-level expressions, not root causes. True resistance usually stems from deeper layers such as fear of failure, fear of judgment, uncertainty about the outcome, or even fear of success and increased responsibility. When we lump all resistance into a single category, we lose the ability to address it with precision. Instead of forcing ourselves to push through with willpower alone, we need clarity. That clarity comes from asking targeted questions that reveal what the mind is actually trying to protect us from. When you feel resistance, pause before acting and observe it without criticism. Notice the physical sensations: tightness in the chest, heaviness in the body, or mental fog that pushes you toward distraction. These signals are data. They reveal whether resistance is rooted in emotional discomfort, lack of clarity, or insufficient preparation. For example, if you're resisting starting a new project, it may not be laziness. It might be that the task is too ambiguous and your brain doesn't know where to begin. In that case, the solution isn't to try harder, but to break the task into defined steps. If you resist social exposure or public speaking, the cause may be fear of negative evaluation rather than the task itself. Identifying that allows you to address self-perception and confidence instead of forcing yourself to simply be brave. Many people resist things that matter because they are meaningful. The brain is wired to avoid perceived risk, and anything that challenges your identity or presents a possibility of emotional discomfort is registered as a threat. This is why dreams often come packaged with resistance. They require vulnerability. To understand the root cause, examine the internal dialogue that appears at the moment resistance arises. Thoughts like, "I'm not ready," "I'll start later," or "what if I fail?" point directly to emotional fear. Thoughts like, "I don't know where to start," indicate structural or logistical uncertainty. Thoughts like, "I don't care anymore," may indicate burnout or misalignment with values. Each type of resistance demands a different response, but awareness is the gateway to all of them. One effective method for identifying the source is writing down the task you're avoiding and then asking yourself why repeatedly, drilling down through layers of reasoning. Another method is envisioning completion and noticing which emotion arises. If it's anxiety, fear is the driver. If it's confusion, clarity is lacking. If it feels draining, the task may conflict with your priorities or identity. Understanding the emotional logic behind resistance allows you to approach action with strategy rather than force. When you know the true cause, you can craft a targeted solution, whether that means removing ambiguity, recalibrating expectations, addressing limiting beliefs, or redefining why the task matters to you. By seeing resistance not as a wall, but as a message, you transform it from an obstacle into a guide. Reducing the barrier to starting is one of the most powerful ways to break through inner resistance, because the brain often perceives tasks not based on their true difficulty, but on how much effort is required to begin. The mind naturally conserves energy, so if a task feels overwhelming or requires a long chain of decisions before action can happen, resistance increases. This is why people often delay tasks they genuinely want to complete. It's not the task itself that creates friction, it's the gap between intention and execution. To overcome this, the focus should shift from completing the full task to simply making the first action as effortless as possible. By lowering the activation energy, you create conditions where taking action becomes easier than avoiding it. One reason starting feels hard is that most goals are framed too broadly. When you tell yourself you need to get in shape, the brain interprets this as a massive, undefined project. But when you decide to put on my shoes and walk for 5 minutes, the action becomes clear, measurable, and less intimidating. This applies to creative projects, learning goals, business ventures, and personal routines. For writing, opening a document is easier than writing a full chapter. For studying, reviewing notes for 5 minutes is easier than mastering an entire subject. Once the first step is taken, momentum builds naturally. The brain rewards action with increased focus, and the effort required begins to decrease because you are no longer starting from zero. Another strategy involves preparing your environment to reduce the number of decisions required before starting. Decisions are cognitively expensive, and resistance often hides in the tiny choices that precede action. Laying out workout clothes the night before eliminates a barrier. Keeping instruments, notebooks, or tools visible instead of stored away makes the effort to begin smaller. Even organizing digital spaces, folders, project files, apps can dramatically reduce friction because it minimizes the time spent figuring out how to start. When the environment is optimized, taking action becomes almost automatic. Time-based tactics also help reduce activation energy. Setting a timer for a short, non-threatening duration such as 5 or 10 minutes bypasses psychological resistance because the commitment feels manageable. The brain can tolerate effort when it knows the discomfort is limited. Often, once the timer starts, continuing becomes easier than stopping. This approach works because it shifts the mental model from "I have to complete everything" to "I only need to begin." The shift from outcome-driven thinking to action-driven thinking reduces emotional weight and encourages consistency. Lowering the barrier to starting also involves emotional reframing. Instead of viewing a task through the lens of obligation or perfection, it becomes an experiment or practice session. When expectations are lowered, pressure decreases and action becomes more accessible. This perspective reduces the fear of making mistakes or not performing well enough, making it easier to begin without hesitation. By combining simplified environments, smaller steps, time constraints, and mental reframing, resistance loses its power because the hardest part, starting, no longer feels like a mountain. Motivation is often misunderstood as the emotional spark that must come before action, but in reality, it is frequently the result of action rather than the cause. Many people wait for the perfect moment, the perfect mood, or the perfect surge of inspiration before beginning, but the brain rarely generates motivation in a vacuum. Instead, it responds to movement, progress, and sensory engagement. When you start doing something, even in a small way, the nervous system begins to shift into a state of focus and momentum. The act of starting triggers biological processes related to reward and attention, making it increasingly easier to keep going. This is why doing the first 5 minutes of a task can radically change how you feel about doing the next 50. The challenge arises when the mind creates a false belief that motivation should precede effort. This belief keeps people stuck because the emotional state they are waiting for never arrives. Instead of waiting for motivation, treating action as the trigger flips the dynamic. When you take action first, you create conditions where motivation can arise naturally. For example, when someone begins exercising, even on days they feel tired or unmotivated, the physical movement increases alertness, warms up muscles, and creates mental engagement. After a few minutes, the body catches up with the intention and motivation builds. If they had waited to feel ready, nothing would have happened. The same principle applies to focus-based tasks like studying or working on creative projects. Before starting, the brain may feel scattered or uninterested because it has not yet entered a task-specific state. But once you begin reading, typing, organizing, or researching, the brain shifts from passive thinking to active involvement. Reward pathways activate as progress is made and the task becomes easier to continue. This biological feedback loop means that motivation is not something to rely on as a prerequisite, but something to cultivate through action. Another important aspect is reducing internal narratives that emphasize emotional alignment before effort. Statements like, "I don't feel like doing this," or "I'm not in the right mindset," reinforce the idea that emotion should dictate behavior. Replacing these thoughts with action-oriented cues shifts control away from feelings and toward behavior. Instead of waiting to want something, You teach your mind that desire grows through participation. This builds mental resilience and prevents cycles of stagnation. This approach also supports long-term consistency. When action is dependent on motivation, effort becomes unpredictable and sporadic. When action comes first, habits can form even on low energy days, building identity and self-trust. Over time, you become someone who takes action regardless of mood, and motivation becomes a reinforcing consequence rather than a starting requirement. This not only improves productivity, but also strengthens confidence because progress becomes self-generated instead of emotionally dependent. Action-first mindset doesn't mean ignoring emotions, but it means recognizing that emotions are dynamic and change after movement begins. The brain is designed to follow the signals provided by behavior, so when behavior leads, the mind adapts. By starting before you feel ready, you train the nervous system to support your goals rather than block them, turning action into the engine that drives motivation rather than the reward you hope to receive beforehand. Detaching identity from struggle is essential because many people internalize resistance as a personal flaw rather than recognizing it as a natural part of progress. When someone believes that difficulty is a reflection of who they are rather than what they are experiencing, struggle becomes intertwined with identity. Thoughts like, if this feels hard, I must not be good enough, or if I really wanted this, it wouldn't be so challenging, create a narrative where resistance becomes evidence of inadequacy. This mindset not only increases self-doubt, but also reinforces avoidance because taking action becomes a direct threat to one's sense of self. Instead of viewing challenges as external obstacles that can be worked through, they become internal judgments that define character. A healthier approach is to see struggle as a state, not a trait. Effort is a signal of growth and adaptation, not a sign of failure. Just as muscles resist weight to become stronger, the mind resists change to maintain familiarity. Resistance is a byproduct of stretching beyond current abilities, habits, or comfort zones. When this perspective shifts, the presence of struggle no longer feels like proof that something is wrong. It becomes evidence that progress is being engaged. This reframing removes shame from the experience of effort, allowing challenges to be faced with curiosity rather than avoidance. Identity-based resistance also appears when people attach actions to self-worth. Someone who believes they are a productive person may avoid tasks where they might fail because failure threatens that identity. Someone who believes they are not smart may avoid learning new skills to protect themselves from experiences that challenge that belief. In both cases, identity becomes rigid, and resistance grows from the fear of identity being contradicted. Detaching identity means allowing roles, abilities, and traits to evolve rather than defining them as permanent truths. One effective way to detach identity from struggle is to shift language from self-defining statements to process-oriented ones. Instead of saying, I'm bad at this, saying, I'm still learning this skill, removes judgment and keeps identity open. Instead of saying, this is just who I am, saying, this is who I've been, but I can change, acknowledges the past without restricting the future. This kind of linguistic shift changes how the brain interprets challenges and allows growth without self-criticism. Another aspect involves recognizing that resistance does not mean lack of desire. People often interpret difficulty as proof that a goal isn't aligned with them, when in reality, meaningful goals often require the greatest effort. Wanting something deeply and struggling to achieve it can coexist. Struggle simply indicates that the path requires more skill, strategy, or consistency, not less passion. When people detach their identity from performance, they can pursue goals with persistence rather than perfection. Detachment also supports emotional regulation. When struggle is seen as external, individuals can analyze challenges more objectively. They become more willing to experiment, seek feedback, adjust their approach, and learn from mistakes because errors no longer feel like threats to their self-image. This leads to sustainable progress instead of cycles of avoidance and self-judgment. Ultimately, Separating identity from struggle allows action to become an expression of growth rather than a test of worth. When effort is no longer tied to who someone believes themselves to be, they can act more freely, take more risks, and engage with challenges as opportunities rather than threats. Resistance often appears strongest in the areas that matter most, making it not only an obstacle, but also a useful compass. The tasks we avoid, delay, or overthink are often the ones that carry the most potential for growth, meaning they challenge identity, stretch skills, or move us into unfamiliar territory. When resistance is viewed through this lens, it transforms from a barrier into information. Rather than interpreting the discomfort as a signal to retreat, it becomes a guide indicating where our attention should go. The direction of resistance highlights areas of opportunity, not areas to avoid. This happens because the brain is wired to seek safety and predictability. Anything that threatens emotional stability, reputation, or comfort triggers psychological resistance even when the task aligns with long-term goals. If there is resistance towards starting a business, it may reflect fear of failure, visibility, or responsibility, all signals that the goal has impact. If there is resistance to having a difficult conversation, it may indicate that the relationship or outcome matters deeply. The strength of resistance often correlates with potential significance. When understood this way, resistance stops being interpreted as danger and begins to function as a compass pointing toward meaningful action. Using resistance as a directional tool requires awareness rather than avoidance. Instead of asking, "How do I get rid of this resistance?" the more constructive question becomes, "What is this resistance trying to protect me from? And what does that reveal about what I care about?" Rather than running from discomfort, one learns to decode it. This shifts the relationship from fear-based avoidance to curious investigation. Resistance becomes data, offering clues about where growth is possible, where values lie, and where effort is most likely to produce transformation. Recognizing resistance as a guide does not mean pursuing every difficult task blindly. It means distinguishing between tasks that provoke resistance because they are misaligned and tasks that provoke resistance because they matter. This distinction can be revealed by noticing the emotional pattern that accompanies resistance. If the feeling is dread mixed with a sense of purpose, it often points to growth. If the feeling is aversion with no internal pull or meaning, the task may not be aligned with values. The presence of meaningful resistance is often accompanied by a quiet sense of importance, even if the task feels intimidating. One effective strategy is to list tasks or goals that provoke the strongest hesitation and examine what lies behind that reaction. Patterns often emerge: visibility, vulnerability, skill gaps, or fear of outcomes beyond control. Each pattern points toward an area where developing confidence would lead to expansion. By following these signals instead of suppressing them, individuals create a roadmap built not just on goals, but on internal transformation. This approach directs effort toward the goals that reshape identity rather than just maintain comfort. Using resistance as a compass turns discomfort into guidance and makes growth intentional. Instead of waiting for clarity to appear before acting, clarity is generated by moving toward the areas we instinctively pull away from. This mindset redefines progress as moving toward the edges of comfort rather than staying within familiar boundaries.